Well, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Chatham House. I'm Robin Niblett. I always start off with a little bit of trepidation because I'm trying to make sure you can hear me, but I can hear my voice echoing something from the far end of the room, so the microphones must be working. Good stuff. Thank you very much for joining us today. As you know, we're going to have a discussion about Britain's place in a changing world, and we are absolutely delighted to be hosting this dialogue. And as all three speakers know, I kept saying this is a dialogue, not a debate, when we discussed this over the phone individually and with each of the offices at the beginning. But those discussions were taking place originally back in October of last year, and by the time we pull this together, it probably ends up feeling more like a debate. And I know that William Hague has just come from having to stand in on Prime Minister's questions, so we're going to give him a moment or two to settle down from debate mode and de-adrenalize. But this is certainly a pivotal moment to be having the kind of discussion that we would like to have today. And this is why we have described it as a dialogue. We want to be able to look to the future. A lot of Britain's discussion about international relations today is inevitably, and probably quite rightly, focused with questions of Afghanistan, Iran, Iraq, Copenhagen. We are captured inevitably by the immediate and by the now. But this is a moment where we are entering a changed world, as we'll discuss in our conversation in a minute. America's allies are changing in their relative power positions. Alliances are under question. International organizations are under question. The rise of China, of India. Where Britain sits in this kind of world is a question that we at Chatham House really felt needed to be asked today. And it's for that reason I think you all had on your seats a little description of a project that we're running that helps in a way frame this discussion that we'll have today about Britain's place in a changing world. We've used the word ambitions and choices because I think we believe, my colleagues and I helping run it, Alex Fiennes and Paul Cornish, the two colleagues working closely with me on this, that one has to think about ambitions and not simply being defensive in the kind of world that we're in today. So we're hopeful that we'll be able to include some of the discussion we've had today and let it inform the conclusions that we make as we come up with our various reports on the project going forward. Now, a quick thing about what we're doing today. This is a moderated discussion. I will pose some questions to each of our three speakers for the first half, let's say roughly, of the time we have. And this meeting is going to run to 2:45 p.m. I will then draw questions from the audience. We've also had a number of questions coming in, as we have many members of Chatham House beyond this room who would like to participate and are participating, partly through the video link that we have here, and we've had questions coming in on our website and our Facebook account, and David will be pleased to know that since he spoke here on one of his first talks here when he just took over as Foreign Secretary, and I don't know, was maybe subtly berating us for being a little bit 19th century, that we have our Twitter account. We've got our typewriter, and it's twittering away, so we are quite well connected up, and we'll be taking some questions as well from beyond the room. If I could please make sure that you all have your mobile phones off, not just on buzz, but please switch them off. I suppose needless to say, this meeting is on the record. We could not have three more capable people to be able to discuss these big questions with us today. I'm not going to introduce them because you all know who each of these individuals are in terms of the parties and the positions that they represent. But I did want to say that having taken some time to read through some of their recent speeches, I do believe these are three individuals who are giving quite a bit of thought to the long-term questions and not just to the near-term questions about Britain's role in the world. And I'd like to start, therefore, with a kind of fundamental question and turn to you, Foreign Secretary David Miliband, to turn to you first with a fundamental question about the British national interest. And actually, this was a question that came in from one of our corporate members, from Andrew Minnier at BP, who asked this question: do we know what our national interest is today? I think the way I look at it and the way I hear other people talk about it, we're caught between perhaps two forces: the rise of a more multipolar world, rising powers thinking very much about their own interests, self-interested, but also we're living in a world of interdependence. And this has been a feature that Gordon Brown has discussed, talk about a global society, interdependent challenges from climate change, from proliferation, from economic integration. Is there some contradiction between how we manage those two forces? Does it affect how we think about the national interest? Is it just to defend British interests in a more dangerous world, or can we be sort of proactive in helping manage interdependence? A big question about how you think about the British national interest.
Well, thank you very much, Robin, and thank you for the invitation for what I hope will be the first of a number of conversations, both under your auspices and under others, as we approach the general election, which is a chance for a democratic conversation. I don't see the two forces that you describe as opposing. In fact, it's quite hard to think of an interdependent world that isn't multipolar. I would describe the British national interest, first of all, in terms of objectives, and second, in terms of processes. I think our objectives can be described under the headings of security, prosperity, and sustainability. And I think the processes that we need to build up are the processes of a multilateral system. If I could just say a word, first of all, about the objectives and then about the processes or the means. I think that the great scourges we face, and that's not a bad way of defining your interests, are on the one hand insecurity and instability. That is a scourge that isn't defined by the threat of territorial invasion. This country has rarely been safer in the last 1,000 years. But as citizens, whether going about our business in this country or abroad, the scourge of terrorism is a real one. So I think the first goal of foreign policy has to be to promote British security and stability and that of its citizens. Secondly, and relatedly, prosperity and inequality, its flip side, unfortunately, are real dangers both in themselves, or there are dangers to our prosperity, but there are also dangers from inequality. It relates to instability and insecurity in important parts of the world. So I think any definition of our national interest, especially for a foreign office that has 15% of its staff working on commercial diplomacy, has to include prosperity as an important part of it, but it can't just be our prosperity, it must be on a global scale. And I think maybe differently than how we would have talked about it 5 or 10 years ago, sustainability has to be on the agenda, not just in terms of climate change, although I think that would be very important, but an unbalanced world is not going to be a world that's either prosperous or secure. So I think that I find it helpful to think about our goals in that sense. Now, how do you go about achieving that? I profoundly believe that a strong multilateral system is the only way in which a country like Britain is going to really be able to serve its interests. Bilateral relations are important, and we'll no doubt talk about them, and some are more important than others. But I think that for a medium-sized country like ours, a weak multilateral system, and in too many ways we do have a multilateral system that isn't strong enough, is a real problem. And I think that the essence of the deadlock that we face in many of the aspects of foreign policy, and the danger of a decade of deadlock, really, is that if we cannot make the multilateral system in its multiple forms work.
Thank you. That's very helpful. William, you have talked about, in your speeches at Chatham House and at IIS, about the importance of reforming international institutions. This has been one of the central sort of driving ideas behind some of the foreign policy thoughts that you've put forward. Do you see this reform of international institutions to deal with a more multilateral world, again, a central part of conservative foreign policy, and as you think about our role in the world going forward as well?
Well, it is a central part. Yes, absolutely right. It's very difficult to bring about. You know, if you think about how to reform the UN Security Council, I think on this we might all have the same policy. Certainly our policy is the same as the government. But securing agreement on that so that the UN Security Council is not just a reflection of the outcome of the Second World War is a phenomenally difficult thing to bring about in the next decade. But yes, that is very important. And I agree actually with a lot of, this is very different from Prime Minister's questions an hour ago, because I agree with a lot of what my opposite number has been saying here, although I suppose I think about it in a slightly different way. I think we should not be ashamed at all, and I'm glad you asked the question about national interest, to speak of our national interest. That is at the heart of foreign policy, particularly promoting our commercial interests. The security and prosperity of our citizens depends on that. But I've argued in one of those speeches you referred to, Robin, for the concept of enlightened national interest, which is that we are safer and better off in the world if our values are well accepted by many other nations, respected by the nations, if our friends and allies are safe and secure and prosperous. So we should think of national interest in that broadest sense. And the reason we need the strong multilateral organizations, as well as a strong sense of our own national interest, is because I think that the 2 or 3 biggest threats to our country in the coming 20 years, let us say, are one, environmental degradation and all the other aspects of an unsustainable world. Secondly, the proliferation of nuclear science into nuclear weapons. And thirdly, all the challenges of international terrorism. And just to illustrate the importance of that, and then to let you go on, that shows, for instance, why you have to think about trying to improve relations with Russia to advance it, because to achieve those broader objectives of dealing with those immense international challenges over the next 20 years, can you imagine doing so without working closely with the other members of the UN Security Council? Again, a really difficult thing to do, and I make no criticism of the Labour government for having had so many difficulties in relations with Russia, but that illustrates why we have to do certain things in order to achieve our broader, enlightened national interests. So that's the way I think about it.
Ed, how about national interests from a Liberal Democrat standpoint and your own personal standpoint?
Well, first of all, can I welcome Chatham House having this debate and also the programme that you're putting on, and look forward to a July conference. And the danger when you have politicians thinking long term, and particularly in foreign policy, is there's a danger you'll get a lot of agreement. And I'm certainly not going to disagree with either of my colleagues here. I think the Foreign Secretary is quite right to talk about the central importance of thinking about our security, our prosperity. Peace and prosperity are obviously critical to foreign policy objectives. And of course, adding on something that Liberal Democrats have campaigned on for many decades now, the significance of our environment, the interdependency of our world, I think, has been emphasised more clearly than anything else in the whole debate about climate change and how we tackle that. So those objectives are absolutely right. And you were right to come to William to talk about the reform of the multilateral organisations. And he was right to talk about how difficult it's going to be. But I think, whether it's here in our continent of Europe, I think the reforms we've seen with the Lisbon Treaty are really important. And I hope they will help Britain and with our partners in the European Union play more strongly into trying to get our voice heard on these key objectives. And I think that those reforms are helpful. They could have gone further, but I think they're a big first step in a very important multinational organisation. I think the UN is always going to be tricky, but one of the advantages of the EU is when the UN fails, often the EU can be a big force where the UN fails. We've seen that time and time again in Zimbabwe and Sri Lanka recently, and no doubt in other areas. I think we should talk, if we're talking about climate change and sustainability, the question whether or not we're going to need new multinational organisations. I'm sort of slightly nervous about creating new organisations when some of the ones that we've got aren't working very well. But when one thinks about the significance of trade and our economic activity linked to climate change, is the WTO fit for purpose for thinking about environmental questions alongside trade questions? And I just pose that as a challenge, because I'm not sure if those sorts of thoughts have really entered the debate strong enough. I know President Sarkozy's talked about an initiative in this area, and I think we need to engage in Britain in that agenda too.
Well, just in case we have too much agreement on the panel, I'm going to pick up on a point you made earlier, Ed, about one of the key agents potentially for British foreign policy in this more complex world, which is our membership of the European Union. And I want to bring in some discussion of the European Union, also of the United States. To a certain extent, British foreign policy has been fluctuating between these two poles of our relationships and interests for some time. We had notions of being a transatlantic bridge. We have had, obviously, our strong alliance in NATO. We have our membership of the European Union. But in this multipolar world, Foreign Secretary, you've talked about the idea of a sort of G3 potentially, that if Britain wants to be able to protect its interests, it's going to need to be a partner of a strong Europe. Otherwise, we're going to get squeezed between the United States and China potentially. Can you just say a bit more about your ideas of a G3, or where the European Union fits in specifically into British national interests and British foreign policy?
What I actually said and think is that if we want to avoid a G2 world, then you need to build up European foreign policy strength, because we're not going to have a G2 plus Britain. And if you want to make sure that this isn't a G2 world, there has to be a strong European voice in it. I think that the notion of a bridge between Europe and America is not very helpful. I mean, after all, what do people do on bridges? They walk across them. And so I don't think that is the best analogy. And it's certainly not the best analogy in a world where power is shifting from west to east, because we need a Europe that thinks beyond the transatlantic relationship. It's got to think about much stronger EU-China relations, EU-India relations, EU-Brazil relations. And I think one of the things that will come out of as well as EU-US relations, and as we've seen recently, the EU isn't not offering enough in its partnership with the US to make it really worthwhile, the US investing a lot in 2 summits a year rather than 1. And I think that's a good challenge to the 27 member states of the EU to make sure that we're putting enough on the table for partnerships, not just with the US but with others, to make those relationships work. So it's got to be a global relationship, not just a transatlantic relationship. But what I feel powerfully and passionately is that our membership of the European Union is not an alternative to strong bilateral relations with another 192 countries in the world. But I can honestly say that in the countries I've visited, 48 countries I've been to as Foreign Secretary, I don't think there's a single one where we haven't talked about EU relations with that country as well as UK relations with that country, whether in the Middle East, whether in China, where I'm going next week up next, or in the US. It is absolutely essential that people do respect and value strong British presence for all the different reasons that we might come into. But I strongly believe that there is a magnification of our foreign policy strength through our membership of the European Union, despite the fact that compromise is needed. But also, people listen to us more bilaterally because of our engagement with the European Union. Just one final point, which I think is interesting. Often the membership of the European Union is contrasted with our membership of the Commonwealth. I know from the Commonwealth Conference summits that I've been to that when one's meeting with groups of Commonwealth countries, they want us to be a strong voice for them in Europe as well. So it's not just that the European Union is a complement to our bilateral relations, it's also a complement to our other multilateral relationships.
But if I can stick with this for a second, how confident are you can have a strong Europe on the international stage at 27 going on 28, going on 30? We look at Afghanistan, you talk about US frustrations in particular, or one area where the European Union has signally failed to be able to act in the one area that it thought it could act, as a civil military player, supporting rule of law, supporting police training. EU membership and EU members have not been particularly active. We found ourselves in a bilateral position, in essence, with the US. How confident are you that, in a way, this G3 idea, that a strong EU can be part of a kind of global
well, I think we've got to make it happen. Predictions are always hazardous, and hard cases make bad law, and Afghanistan is the hardest of cases. But I think that there is a challenge for the 27 countries of Europe. After all, we all hold veto power on foreign policy in the European Union. There's no threat to the national interest or the national position there. But I think we can make it go, even in Afghanistan, actually, where the EU is upgrading its relations. Probably not enough, but I think it is the hardest of cases. Take an example where I think we really do need to do better, and that is Russia. You see, the expansion of the European Union gives a lie to the idea that widening has meant weakening of the European Union. Actually, the enlargement of the EU has rebalanced the EU's attitudes towards a country like Russia. I think we're far stronger in thinking about our relations with Russia when we've got countries like Poland in the European Union, all of those Eastern enlargement countries actually. And I would say that there is a real opportunity. Now, we may not take that opportunity, but it's up to us to make sure that we're in there with the ideas, the alliances, the passion and the push to really make sure that the European Union makes these Lisbon institutions work. Because we haven't got any excuses left.
I'll come back to, I think, some of those Lisbon institutions we talk about sort of organising for influence in a minute. William, turning to you, again, a similar set of questions, but let me just come in. The Conservative Party, David Cameron in particular, made that now somewhat famous phrase about wanting to have a solid but not slavish relationship with the United States. In terms of reforming international institutions, I think you've taken a more sceptical approach to what the European Union can or cannot achieve. I'm not going to try to set up your view of the EU position. You can do that in a minute.
That they were slightly more sceptical than we are.
On what the EU can achieve internationally, I think we'll be interested to see how much division there really is. But in any case, is there a risk that, from a Conservative standpoint, we end up kind of caught between two worlds? A more standoffish relationship with the United States, but a not fully committed relationship to the European Union, and Britain somewhat stuck between two stools, if not being a bridge, not getting walked over, not getting noticed at all?
No, I don't think so, and we would work very hard to make sure we didn't fall between those two stools. We think solid but not slavish is absolutely the right way to describe the right relationship with the United States. We are the junior partner in that relationship, but there is, as I think Douglas Hurd has often argued, an art of managing that relationship. And sometimes that means you can disagree. The United States, I think, will always remain our indispensable partner in intelligence, in nuclear cooperation, in so much military cooperation. We are the largest investors in each other's countries. That is a truly indispensable relationship. But we are allowed to say from time to time they've got something wrong. The first speech I gave as Shadow Foreign Secretary, which is now 4 years ago, was in Washington, saying that America was losing its moral authority, that inadequate definitions of torture, that Guantanamo Bay, extraordinary rendition flights were undermining that essential moral authority. Didn't go down well with everybody in Washington. But when I went into the State Department the next day, somebody took me one side and said, "You should make more speeches like that, Mr. Haig." We are allowed to differ and to give frank advice from time to time. And I think we've not always done that in the last decade. And I don't think that in any way excludes a strong relationship with European nations as well. I have been, I think you said you were coming back to the Lisbon institutions, yep. And I think some of the misgivings we've had about that are now showing their validity, but we're very much in favour of Europe using its collective weight in the world to a greater extent. Take the bulk. One of the things I'm most worried about in foreign policy in our near neighbourhood is the situation in Bosnia, and I think that Europe needs a more muscular policy. There are European troops deployed. Europe is the greatest giver of aid to that country. There are things that Balkan countries want from the European Union. There is a representative of the EU there. If we can't muster the collective will and strength to make sure that the political process is advancing, not retreating in the Balkans, in Bosnia, well then that doesn't say much for what we can achieve together in the future.
But do you think part of the risk, and the lights are getting lighter, so we must be saying more clear things. Do you think there's a risk, however, that the kind of relationship the Conservative Party has with European mainstream parties as a whole could undercut your ability then to be able to draw the EU into being a more effective player in particular dimensions of foreign policy? I mean, there is, your answer's being preceded by the lighting.
The lights are going out all over Europe.
TV trying to get it right. But is there a risk that in a way the kind of relationship that you're potentially striking with parties in the European mainstream, let's say, is going to affect Britain's ability then to drive the EU on those areas, Russia, Bosnia? It's very easy to say these are the important things, but if you haven't had a relationship that precedes it in other aspects of European integration, it gets very difficult to then push it in the foreign policy sphere, surely.
Well, that relationship is already going on. In advance of a general election, a shadow foreign secretary, if people think there is any chance of you winning the election, has a lot of meetings with foreign ministers from all over Europe. And I've seen the great majority of them over the last 6-12 months. And their willingness to work with Britain is there, whoever wins the general election. So they do not withdraw their cooperation with the United Kingdom because things change in a general election. And when I've talked to them about what can be achieved together, about the agenda of a Conservative government in really wanting to be active from the beginning, in driving forward the single market, in really pushing things on climate change in the EU, and I've made a lot of substantive proposals about that, in relations with Russia, on the Iranian nuclear program, on the Balkans, they can see that we are going to be extremely active and positive in how European nations can work together. And I think once that is understood, well then the niceties of European political parties and alliances are a minor consideration by comparison.
Let me just come in on this point, because William has a great disadvantage here, because he does indeed have the meetings with the other European foreign ministers, but then they come and talk to me afterwards.
Sometimes they come to me afterwards. Just be careful here.
It's a great disadvantage for him, because they come to the monthly Foreign Affairs Council, and what they say is, Mr. Haig, he's consistent, he's holding positions that he's held for 10 or 15 years, but he is virulently against the cooperation that has been built up in the European Union over the last 20 years. They say he was against consistently the Amsterdam Treaty, he was against the Nice Treaty, and he's been against the Lisbon Treaty. And so they say we give him credit for consistency, but they also say they believe he is profoundly wrong about how he sees British influence being exercised, not just in Europe, but around the world. And the symbol of that is that these right-of-centre parties that make up the European People's Party have been divorced by William Hague's Conservatives. Actually, William Hague and David Cameron together have pulled them out of the mainstream in the European Parliament. They've joined up with 6 other parties outside the mainstream. They've rejected Mrs. Merkel's party, Mr. Sarkozy's party, Mr. Reinfeldt's party. And William said last June, well, don't worry, there are only 7 of us, 7 parties now, but we'll be having some more. I haven't seen a single announcement of new recruits to the European Conservative and Reform group, because it is outside the mainstream, without influence on committee chairs or votes or anything else. And that is the fundamental issue. And we should at least be honest that there is a profound difference on this European issue. It is a consistent position that William and his party has held, but I think it's a profoundly damaging one.
Let me come in, though. I must say that Amsterdam, Nice and Lisbon were not exactly a roll of honour treaties that have galvanised the European people, that have led to greater support for European institutions at a popular level. It might be very popular within particular mainstream parties in Europe, but they haven't necessarily been a series of treaties that have stood the EU particularly well.
They've allowed the EU to expand to 27, and the fundamental point is that we actually all agree in the enlargement of the European Union. There's never been any difference between the political parties in Britain about the importance of enlargement and the rightness of enlargement. But I'm afraid the Conservative Party have put themselves in a position of opposing the means to make an enlarged Europe work. And that is fundamental to this. It's nothing that William has to be ashamed of, that he's a deep Eurosceptic, but he is. And his party has moved in a similar direction. So that...
how kind of you.
I'll let you come in. Let me let Ed come in first. So
back one more time.
As you're in the middle, then you'll come back. Yes, Ed, go on.
I think we need to look at Britain's membership of the European Union almost as if you're in Beijing or Washington. And when you look at from those perspectives, they see an anti-European position that is sometimes put by the Conservative Party, sometimes by other parties, as quite bizarre. I've talked to American politicians who cannot believe the Conservative Party have come out of the EPP. They cannot believe that Britain doesn't want to engage more in Europe, whether it's on defence cooperation, security cooperation, economic cooperation, and so on. And many of you have read the book by Mark Leonard about how China views the rest of the world. And one of the things that China's most impressed about with the European Union, it's not impressed about everything of the European Union, let's be clear about that. I'm not starry-eyed about the European Union, even though I'm a Liberal Democrat, and the Chinese aren't either. But they're incredibly impressed by the formation of the single currency. They're incredibly impressed by the development of the single market, because obviously they look at the economic aspects very importantly. And for people to come out of the mainstream, it does us a disservice. And if you're a businessman in Britain, thinking about your relationships in China or America, the fact that one of the main British parties isn't in the main centre-right bloc in the European Parliament, able to influence really directly, hands-on, the way European legislation on the single market and its relations in trade policy with the rest of the world, the fact that the centre-right party in Britain has moved out of that, has isolated itself from that, is actually quite shocking to people. So don't just look at it from a European perspective, don't look just at a British perspective, but look at it from the American point of view and the Chinese point of view. I'll make one other point, which actually to argue against you, Robin, about the way the European Union has been developed in recent years. Because we hear all the criticisms of where the European Union doesn't do so well, and we all know those. We don't hear enough about where the European Union does extremely well. And I'll give you one classic example, which means that every family in Britain is safer because of the European Union. Last December, I had the privilege of going to The Hague, to Europol and Eurojust, 2 organisations where European police and European prosecution authorities are working more closely than they've ever done to catch the most serious criminals, organised criminals across the European Union. We're talking about terrorists, we're talking about drug traffickers, human traffickers, some of the most wicked people imaginable. And now, because of European cooperation, we're far more effective in those. And Britain is one of the most active in Europol and Eurojust. And guess what? In The Hague, in the offices of Europol and Eurojust, you're seeing American organisations that want to combat crime working with European ones. You're seeing the Russian Federation come to The Hague to work with Europol and Eurojust. You're seeing people talk about Africa and Asia wanting something like Europol and Eurojust. This is what's happened in the last 10 years on cooperation across Europe. It's fantastic, and we should be singing the praises of the European Union, not doing it down every time, and not threatening to pull out of that cooperation.
Am I allowed to hit back now?
Get back in PMQ mode. Exactly.
Just to be combative for a moment, to be told that you have to be one of the main political groupings by a Liberal has a comical aspect to it.
That's okay. We hold the balance of power. Let's be clear. We hold the balance of power in the European Parliament, so that's a very unwise thing to say. We may be holding the balance of power in the Westminster Parliament as well. So forget that too.
Yes, well, that's why the pound is plunging at the.
One day you're blaming Mr. Brown, and then you're blaming the Liberal Democrats. You make your mind up.
Let's not seek towards consistency. Keep going.
But I know, there's an election on, and we make these points, and it's understandable other parties make these points, but it's not how the rest of the world sees it. I remember being told, I read in one newspaper when I went to Washington a few months ago, that everybody in Washington was going to be asking about the EPP and the European Parliament. Well, I went all around the State Department, the White House, met all the senior senators on Capitol Hill, and not a single person, while we were discussing Afghanistan, Iran, the non-proliferation treaty, said, oh, now what about where you sit in the European Parliament? That was not the discussion.
I know one person who certainly did raise it with you.
They're very polite, William.
Well, if they said that, that was not what actually happened. Let me also wonder, I question when David talks about, who has influence in Europe. When David was campaigning so hard that it was essential for Tony Blair to be elected president of the EU, and I was pointing out to all the nations of Europe that he shouldn't be, who had most influence on the outcome, I wonder? Because there was certainly
bad argument.
There was even one socialist government which very much took the point, and it was not even possible for the socialist group to endorse Mr. Blair as president, and I had a very good discussion with that socialist government. So the idea that you cannot, as long as you set out in the right way and have the right agenda, that you can't work with the other nations of Europe, I think is a fanciful one. Yes, we certainly have been against the recent European treaties, and the parties that denied people a referendum on that, I think, devalued and betrayed our democracy, given the pledges that they had given. But we recognise we can't have a referendum on something that's already embodied now in the European treaties. So we have to try and make some of those institutions work. And I wish Cathy Ashton well, actually, in her position. I've not joined in any criticism of her. I think she may have been given an impossible job. And I do have concerns about the institutions created by the Lisbon Treaty. But will we be, if we are elected, a strong force for Europe using its collective weight in the world on all the sorts of issues that I've been describing? Yes, we will. And I think within a few days of being elected and that cooperation getting underway, this sort of party rhetoric will seem a bit outdated.
It's important, though, this, because William does have a position. He articulated it from this platform that he's got 5 priorities in foreign policy, and not one of them includes mention of the European Union. I mean, that is a profound point that there are diplomats here from all European countries, from other countries, need to understand. And I think that we should discuss it, not in a way, not in a PMQ's way, but in a serious way. Because you can try and make the argument, as you did here, that, in fact, Europe is not part of foreign policy. That was your
No, I haven't made that argument at all.
No, if you read the speech again, you'll see.
Well, I think I know what was in the...
You started by saying...
all people know what was in the speech.
You started by saying, this is a speech about Europe, about foreign policy, so I'm not going to be talking about Europe. And you covered 5 other areas, and you said they were your priorities for foreign policy.
And Area 4 includes the improvement and reform of multilateral institutions, including the European Union.
If you go back to it, you'll see that the European Union is not a big part of the way in which you want to see British foreign policy develop. Let's be clear about that. And I think there are then 2 issues. One, is it right to say that we can pursue a foreign policy without a big role for Europe? And secondly, if you agree, if in fact you want to say you do agree Europe should have a big role in foreign policy, the second point is, how do you have influence in Europe? And then it's to do with the quality of your ideas as well as the quality of your alliances. And I do think it is important to understand that many of the scare stories about the European Union that are about the super state and European armies have frankly been put to bed over the last 10 years. And we now have a fundamental issue about making the European Union work, and making it work at 27 and utilizing the power of 27. And honestly, to believe that if you're outside the mainstream, you've got more influence than if you're inside the mainstream simply doesn't add up.
I'm sure we're going to come back to Europe on some of the questions. We've got a number of them as well here. But let me move on, because certainly as I look at Britain's role in the world, obviously the EU is likely to be an important part, as all three of you have mentioned, though from different angles. But there's some very different questions as well. Certainly as somebody who worked in Washington for 10 years, as I did, and came back to the UK back in 2007, I was struck by the attempt by governments here to put Britain in a position as a thought leader. So I want to move off Europe. It may have a European dimension to it or not, but I want to think a little bit about and hear your views on what makes Britain distinct in international relations today. We do have, I think, as a lot of British people here in the audience and a lot watching as well, we have a kind of view of ourselves as a somewhat unique country, a first-rank country, somewhat apart from Europe in our self-definition, however much we may or may not want to use it as a tool for being able to further our interests and further global interests. But are we still a unique country? What makes us distinctive? What makes us different? Is it as a thought leader? Is it from a soft power standpoint? David, and others have talked about Britain as a hub. We've had ideas of sort of liberal conservatism as perhaps a kind of particular approach that Britain might be able to take. Ed, you've talked about ethical foreign policy, and this should be a defining aspect of what British foreign policy is about in some of your speeches. If I could just each of you to have a think for a minute, stepping outside the EU bear pit, if you see what I'm saying, and into what makes us distinct still today. Are there things that make us distinct? David?
I think there are. The combination of hard and soft power, of membership of NATO, the Commonwealth, the UN Security Council, and the EU, give us a distinctive place as what I call a global hub, and I think all of us on this platform would want to develop that. We're a country with global connections of culture and business that I think are very, very profound and important. But I do think ideas matter. Let me just address these ideas. You see, if you think about climate change, the Stern report on climate change did change the global debate about the economics of climate change in a profound and important way. I think that the Afghan conference that we held the month before last in January has given a new dynamic to the military and civilian effort in Afghanistan, because it's directed towards a political settlement that dared not speak its name for a long time in Afghanistan. We're able to make ventures like this in part because of the strength in universities and in think tanks. I also think that the strength of campaign groups in this country is a very significant part of our global reach. The Amnesty International, the Oxfams, the Christian Aids that are part of this country. And I think we have a duty to think here about where is the thought leadership going to need to be in the next period. And I think that, to pick up something that both Ed Davey and William Hague have referred to, they've both talked about terrorism and the difficulties associated with it. Unsafe space around the world, ungoverned space, is a fundamentally dangerous issue that I think we'd all recognize as being important. East Africa is a good example. But what's happened to the responsibility to protect? It's been passed in 2005 by the UN. Mm-hmm. There are profound issues underpinning the stasis that exists at the UN. And I think one issue where, not on a partisan basis, or not even on a solely governmental basis, but from the different political perspectives, but also including academia, this notion of a responsibility of governments to its own people and to the international system is essential in an interdependent world. But it's going to become meaningless quite quickly unless we give it definition and heft. And one of my lessons over the last 3 years, because we do have similar positions on reform of the UN Security Council, unless we get to grips with the fundamental issues that underpin the differences in places like the UN, and responsibility to protect is a good example, we're not going to make progress. And I think that the thought leadership is a good phrase. That we certainly need to be in that business.
William, thoughts on kind of what makes us distinct and so on? Is it in can be thought leadership, but are there other aspects in particular that you would?
Yeah, I don't dissent on that. We've slotted back into agreement here after a little disagreement earlier on. I don't dissent from anything that David Miliband just said, actually, about our role in the world, about the things that we can influence. I think all of that is very true. And I think just to extend that thought a little bit, I think one of our challenges is that many of the countries that are emerging as greater powers than they were in the world, greater economic and political powers still have a very narrowly defined concept of national interest in their foreign policy. They've not yet taken on that thinking of the responsibility for affairs elsewhere in the world other than advancing their own commercial and political interest. And that's true even of democratic countries. We are at a different stage. An old democracy used to everything that happened in the in the world wars, our role on the UN Security Council. And so I think it is part of our role when we have the long discussions with our colleagues in other countries to always be trying to edge them to that sense of responsibility for how do we stop nuclear proliferation unless countries, and it's the leading countries of the world, take some joint responsibility for it, not do a side deal with Iran that turns a blind eye to that nuclear development. So I think we have to be right at the forefront of all of that, and indeed then in carving out the actual details of new multilateral agreements. I'm very conscious that if the general election is held on the 6th of May, the Non-Proliferation Treaty Review Conference will be taking place at that time. And whoever wins the election, if it is a new government, we have to immediately get to grips with that conference. There's not a lot of disagreement between the parties about what Britain should be proposing. But making sure the right proposals are put forward, workable proposals, for that one of the most fundamental pillars of the security of the modern world is a major practical British role in thought leadership. And then I think, sorry, I know I must stop, there's a whole issue then, maybe we'll come on to this, of how we use all these advantages we've got in the world to establish beyond Europe and North America, which we've discussed, stronger, as I see it, elevated bilateral links with many other countries of the world, right across culture, education, diplomatic, where appropriate, military cooperation. I think that is a major new drive that is required in British foreign policy in the future.
Well, I want to come back to this business of how we kind of exert influence, and I think there'll be a good time to come back to this idea of hitting those mid-level powers in a minute. Well, I'll take some questions from the audience. But Ed, first to you, some comments on what makes us unique, but let me pose a question to you. In your party conference speech last year, you were talking very much about the virtues of ethical foreign policy, quite critical of arms sales, weaponry, overinvestment on the military side, nuclear weapon upgrades, etc. Do you believe that, therefore, Britain's military capabilities, in a way, are not part of what makes us special and what makes us unique? In other words, is the military aspect of what Britain brings to the table actually almost a negative rather than a positive?
No, far from that. I mean, I think our armed forces are a key part of what makes us special, because we have some of the best armed forces in the world, and there'll be a complete agreement on that. So I think you're maybe misreading where we were going with that one. We have some views about how the arms trade needs to be, the rules need to be toughened up, and mistakes have been made. I mean, I was pointing those out, and we have some differences with the other two on decisions which we believe have been taken too early with respect to Trident renewal, and we do think that a like-for-like replacement of Trident isn't the way to go. But in terms of the wider picture that my colleagues have been talking about, again, there's going to be quite a lot of agreement here. I'm hoping your researchers are all taking notes for your projects. But I would add to the list of the real expertise that Britain has and the real special nature of it, some of our economic skills, in particularly things like pharmaceuticals, what one remembers. I'd also point to our higher education. The Foreign Secretary touched on this, but I think our universities are absolutely critical. So many people come from around the world, from China, from India, to our universities. And if we see massive cuts to higher education in the coming spending round, that actually could undermine our soft power. And let's remember that when we look at the overall spending envelope. So I'd put that. One other thing I'd like to add, follows on from what the Foreign Secretary said with respect to civic society and the strength of that in the UK, and that is our diversity in population in Britain. The fact that we have big Indian and Pakistani diaspora, the fact that we have such a multicultural society is a huge strength, I believe, in our foreign policy, and I think we should add that to the equation when we're looking at how we approach the world. Inevitably, when you do that balance sheet analysis, as we're all doing here, and you then work out where our interests in playing that, I think we come back to the discussion we had at the start in terms of those objectives. I think Britain does have a unique role to play, but it is this issue about values in the new world, which, again, the Foreign Secretary talked about, and I do want to support him what he said in picking up the baton on responsibility to protect. And I think we need to think imaginatively about how we take that forward, because it really has got into the sands of the United Nations. It really isn't going forward very quickly. There are many other things to worry about. William quite rightly talked about the NPT review conference. So how can we get some more energy behind the R2P proposals? And I would argue we could look at an analogy from how we got the International Criminal Court off the ground. In other words, rather than putting it into an existing institution, we had a process, a treaty, which almost was a campaigning tool. People campaign around the world to get people to sign up to the ICC. Maybe we need a new initiative on responsibility to protect, which is a treaty-based thing rather than a UN-based thing, to try to persuade people over time and gradually get to a critical mass where we can implement R2P. And I think R2P is incredibly important, not just in terms in the values that Britain can give to the rest of the world, but in terms of how we would reallocate resources in foreign policy, in our intelligence services, in DFID and so on. Because if you take R2P seriously, you take the agenda of prevention of conflict really more seriously than the current policy framework allows. So I think that's what's really excites me about R2P. Yes, it's got an ethical human rights dimension to it, but I think it would feed into the whole way we think about foreign policy.
Well, we've got a number of questions that came in actually a little earlier today on the balance between development funding and traditional, let's say, Foreign Office practices, and how future governments may think about that balance. And I'm going to bring some of those up in a minute. But I do want to open up to the audience. We've got a lot of people here, I'm sure, got pressing questions. I'm going to take maybe 2 or 3 questions rather than one at a time, which would not be enough time for all that. So let me take a few questions. I'll throw a couple in that have come in electronically, and then make sure that we come back towards the end, in particular on how we organize a little bit for influence, because that's a key point. First, question there, please. Microphone here. I'll come here. Yeah.
Thank you. Nicholas McLean. Another advantage that
Hold the
Britain
microphone
has,
close to your mouth.
another advantage that Britain has is, of course, the English language. But it does have a reverse side. And since the Second World War, Britain has been very effective through efforts of the Foreign Office in promoting learning of foreign languages. The Scarborough Report, the Hayter Report, but it's over 20 years since the last big report, the Parker Report, and there's been a decline in our effectiveness since that time. Both European languages, which are no longer compulsory late in secondary school, and the languages for the key new countries, like the Asian countries. Can the Foreign Office take the lead, whoever's in charge of it after the next election, in having a new major look at this issue of foreign language learning? It'll help us listen, it'll help us persuade.
First, let me just take a couple more first here at the front here. No, there's a person here. No, in the front. Sorry, 2 rows back, and I'm going to a lady 2 rows back.
Thank you.
The microphone,
Nick Mabey from E3G. The UK security strategy talks about the rule of law. I think it's 22 times, and everybody here mentioned multilateralism as a core part of our security strategy. It's actually unclear in government who actually is in charge of that. And when it comes to trade-offs against unilateral deployment or investment in international institutions, where we should put our resource. It's very difficult, as you say. We're only going to get a few outcomes. So where would you put your investment for, say, 3 priorities over the next 5 years to make a real change in building international institutions, whether multilateral or plurilateral? And where do you think the biggest trade-offs are on those? Because it's not clear, as I say, that we have that trade-off on the management of the international system as part of our security strategy is clearly defined at the moment.
Give us one example. What would you have on your list?
I'd probably have Copenhagen and corruption on my list.
Okay, just to people know exactly the questions. Just pass it. Yes, pass it there. Yep.
Timothy Garton-Ash, Oxford University. On the US-European relationships, impeccable high-level American sources tell us that Hillary Clinton and others conveyed to William Hague and to others a clear message that the United States is concerned that if the Conservatives win the election, Britain should remain a full, constructive member of the European Union, not least in foreign policy. I wonder if we could ask William Hague to give us his reaction to that message, which clearly was conveyed, and then perhaps have David Miliband, Ned Davey react to his reaction.
Which way that's going to go? I think we heard that already.
Setting you up.
So the lady reaching there, then I'll take another group in a minute. Yeah, one more.
Cambridge Deutsche Welle. One place
Keep your
was
microphone close to
mentioned.
your mouth. From Deutsche Welle, yeah?
From Deutsche Welle, it came to Balkans was mentioned in relation with EU, and one place that both Britain and EU is playing a very crucial role is Kosovo. I wonder if I could have an assessment of the progress so far, 2 years after independence. How much has it contributed to the security there? And what do you think EU and Britain should do to ensure that the road to EU for the whole region, not only for Kosovo, is run smoothly and without unnecessary delays?
And I'm just so that you're really disciplined on your answers, and I'm fair on the questions coming in from here. We did get one particular question targeted on Turkey. You're thinking about Turkey at a pivotal moment in its development as a country internally, but also internationally. How far up is that in your thinking, and how important is it, one of those bilateral relations in which the EU, in a way, has been acting almost as a negative force, perhaps? You might disagree. A negative force rather than a positive force in recent years. Rather than giving everyone a chance to come back necessarily on what William says on Europe, but let me start, David, with you. And again, don't have to answer all of them. I think take a pick, and if I feel one question is getting left out, I'll come back to it and make sure somebody picks it up.
Let me start in the Balkans, because I think it's a very good question. If Europe's to be about anything, it must be to be looking after its neighbourhood. If European foreign policy is to be about anything, it's got to start with its neighbourhood. I think we're agreed on the panel that the vision of all of the countries of the Western Balkans coming into the European Union is the right vision. I think it's a very important one. It's one of the few things that unites most people in the Western Balkans. I think that the ledger on Kosovo would say that in terms of recognition, up to now I think 64 or 65 countries, that's actually gone along the central case. It's not been superb, but it's been on the central case. In terms of governance and corruption issues, I think there are some major issues to address. In terms of the economy, 2008 was not a good time to declare your independence, given what was happening on the global economic front, and there are some big economic issues there. I think in terms of relations with Serbia, however, one would have to say that the Tadic government has trod a quite careful course, a welcomely careful course. The International Court of Justice is sitting. That's obviously going to be an absolutely key moment. Our own legal view is absolutely clear that there's no reason for people to wait for the ICJ judgment. But I think it's very, very important that the facts that now exist in the Western Balkans are consolidated after the ICJ judgment. So I would say that Kosovo has gone down the risk register, and Bosnia is up everybody's risk register. Karl Schwarzenberg, the former Czech Foreign Minister, and I wrote to all EU colleagues in 2008 about Bosnia and about our concerns, and I think they're widely shared on this panel. On, I think, Turkey, I'm glad you called it, you said it should be in the list of rising powers. I think it is remarkable that in this country we have 3 political parties supporting the position of Turkish entry into the European Union. I think it's a very, very significant. I think it's the only country in Europe that's got that degree of consistency. I wouldn't want to be held to it, but I think it's very, very important. There is a massive debate going on within Turkey as well as within the EU, and I think they're two sides of the same coin, really. I am very, very clear that for reasons of energy, never mind for bridge building with the Islamic world, the relationship of the EU to Turkey is of major geostrategic importance over the next 20 years. And it's absolutely clear that if we turn the European Union into effectively a sort of Christian club where you can't come in because you're a country of 80 million Muslims, that is a terrible message to send, but in substantive terms, we're absolutely shooting ourselves in the foot on the energy front. There's a different question, which is whether or not we can achieve the goal that we share. I mean, the easy thing in foreign policy is to have a position. The difficult thing is actually to bring it about. And we have a real job to do with our, some of our European colleagues. But I think there's also a case that the reforms in Turkey are going to be important on that. And linked, obviously, this just leads me to my third and final point, is Cyprus. Because Cyprus holds the key not just in some ways to Turkish relations with the EU, it relates to something else that relates to Tim Garton-Nash's question without sort of getting in on a partisan hit at this stage, which is EU-NATO relations. I mean, the truth is that it's my personal position and the government's position that the EU's defence identity is a vital complement to NATO. And it's fantastic that American administrations of both stripes talk very positively about ESDP. But EU-NATO cooperation will only really take off when the Cyprus sore is no longer a sore. And the talks that are going on at the moment are of the utmost importance, because I don't think we'll have a better opportunity than the two leaders at the moment, and the smoke signals are not particularly happy at the moment, and I think it's important that I send the message, and I'm sure my colleagues would agree, that this is the moment for both sides in Cyprus to make the compromises that are essential, not just in their own interests, because I don't think there'll be a better opportunity, but actually for a wider set of geopolitical reasons, including the future of the EU and NATO.
William, over to you.
I very much want to reinforce what David Miliband just said about Cyprus, and I won't labour the point about Turkey. There is cross-party agreement. I think for us to turn Turkey away from the EU would be a catastrophic strategic error for European nations. But we are in agreement about that, and indeed about the question about the Balkans, about Western Balkan nations joining the EU. Again, much more difficult to bring about than it looks at first sight, of course. Very, very difficult, because of the difficult pattern of relationships between those countries, and as each one of them joins the EU, there will be some renewed difficulties with the next one joining the EU. So this will require really long-term, gritty British engagement to help push that along, and the approach to Bosnia that I was talking about earlier. Just quickly on the other questions, there was the question about what we hear from American politicians. Usually in those sorts of meetings, it's me that brings this up. Maybe they wait for that. Maybe they're polite, and they wait. And when they hear what I have to say about the approach I've described to European affairs, I don't think they have many concerns about that, because they can see it will be a highly active and activist approach within European affairs if there is a Conservative government. What would be the biggest international agreements to invest time in? Well, the doing better than Copenhagen is really very important over the coming year. I think the future of NATO and all the work that is going on that at the moment needs to be brought to a successful and meaningful conclusion, with meaningful purpose, meaningful concept for NATO in the future. And I will always return to nuclear proliferation, because I think it is such a central, massive danger to the world over the next 20 years. And the other, just quickly, the question about foreign languages. I think this illustrates an important point, which is that we need to increase the capability of the Foreign Office in British government to guide or lead the policies of domestic departments. Foreign policy is not just a matter for the Foreign Office. It means we have to get all sorts of things in a line. Our approach to education and higher education, cooperation with other countries, which Ed has mentioned, our visa policies, so many different things all have to come into line to have an effective foreign policy. And I think that the Foreign Office, in the way British government works, has lost some of its capability and power to bring that about in recent years, and I would love to be able to put that right.
Thank you very much. Ed, did you have a couple you wanted to come in on?
On the foreign language.
Sorry, have you lost?
My party leader speaks 5 foreign languages, so he's particularly keen on this. And he learned Spanish in order to woo his current wife. So that's obviously an incentive to
His current wife.
His current wife.
Unfortunate.
his only wife.
Way of putting it.
I had to learn Welsh.
I'm going to get slapped over the wrist after this.
Diplomacy.
Let me come back to my own constituency, so on safer ground. Saturday mornings in my constituency in Kingston and Surbiton, South East London, there are schools teaching people in my constituency Tamil, Hebrew, Urdu, Arabic, Korean, Gujarati. There's an awful lot of languages being taught but they're often actually by the communities themselves and not in the, actually into our schools. And I think there's an awful lot that can be done there, as well as in the education system
Before you go to your next point, can I just comment specifically on that question? Because it's something that's come up in a couple of the working groups we've had. In fact, William Wallace, who's on the senior advisory group for this project, raised this particular point. How a multicultural Britain, let's use that phrase, or a multi-ethnic Britain, you said it was a strength earlier. Is it a strength? You've had to work within this. But can you find yourself trapped by particular isolated positions where you have to react in each case to this problem because this particular constituency is strength?
Look, the fact that this country is a mirror to the world, the fact that each one of the 48 countries I visited, there's a diaspora in this country who's passionate in following the politics and the economics of those countries, the media is joint between those countries. You can't be a global hub if you're not connected by people as well as by airwaves.
And the truth is, both sides of the argument are often represented here.
We see that in this room quite often.
We are true mirror. Can I go back just to one of the other points? On Turkey, I think there's an agreement, but I just go further. The significance, strategic significance of Turkey, given that it borders Syria, Iraq, Iran, Armenia, Georgia, I think, I'm not sure if my map's right, but it's a huge player there. Therefore,
Jordanian ambassadors here. Be careful, Ed. I think the geography was going well until you
were wrong. On that basis, and in terms of energy issues facing the EU, in terms of drug trafficking, a whole range of issues, Turkey is absolutely critical to. And I think we've got to talk to our other European partners who are worried, possibly in times of recession, about the issues of mobility of labour across the EU. I mean, we've got to face up to these issues. The truth is, the European Union will be stronger with Turkey there. Our economies will be more prosperous. We've got to have a more grown-up debate about immigration within the European Union, because it's a real strength. And I think Britain, I think, could be a real strong voice in that area. On defence, and with respect to the Conservative position, and I do want to understand a bit more, William, about how you're looking at this, because we've heard from Liam Fox that you're very keen on Anglo-French cooperation now. Didn't used to be, but you are now very, very keen on that. But we're also told by Liam that he's keen on it because he hopes to undermine the ESDP by working more with France. Now, that really isn't what our American colleagues want, and I think that's a real problem in your position. And take the European Defence Agency, the EDA, which has been strengthened under Lisbon. Liam is completely against that, though that holds a critical role in the future as we try to reform the defence market in the European Union and try to get cost savings with greater procurement. So I think you've really got to address that at some stage. Finally, on the institutions point, I agree with William with respect to NPT and others. The only thing I would say is within the European Union itself again, some of the ideas around, particularly with neighbourhood policy, neighbouring nations to the EU, I think really need a lot of investment of time and energy in. Many people here in this country are a bit sniffy over the proposals that came from Paris to work more closely with North African countries and other countries around the Mediterranean. I think that was absolutely central. I think we really should be doing that, reaching out to those Arab countries, those Muslim countries in North Africa and around the Mediterranean. I think that would be great for Europe and great for those countries.
Well, let me let William perhaps come back in a minute on the issue if you want to, William, on the STP and Anglo-French. But let me draw a couple in. I've already, I'm afraid, I've got 4 questions here which are already listed at the moment. So let me see if I have time at the end for another one or not. First, Charles. Here, I'm going to go to the back for a couple of questions as well.
Thank you. Charles Grant from the Centre for European Reform.
Keep the microphones close you can.
Right. One of the happy trends in the second half of the last century was the spread of democracy and better respect for human rights across much of the world. That seems to have gone into a bit of a reverse in the last decade. A related, equally worrying trend for some of us is the decline in relative terms of the West compared to other emerging powers. And the link between these two trends is that emerging powers it seems, even if they're democratic, like India or South Africa or Brazil, they tend not to support democratic outcomes in foreign policy. You can't rely on these new emerging powers to support democracy. So given these, I think, rather alarming trends, are our panellists concerned about them, and what, if anything, can Britain and or the EU do to try and reverse those trends?
Gentleman here, right here, please. And then I'm going to the lady in red and lady in the middle there.
Ronald Harrison, Chatham House. The country that dare not speak its name and has not been referred to by any of you is Israel. Here you have the Middle East, which is perhaps the most neuralgic point in the present world affairs, outside Afghanistan maybe. And it seems to me that Britain is widely perceived as practicing a double standard in, on the one hand, bringing pressure on Iran to give up the possible hunt for nuclear weapons, but on the other hand, saying nothing at all about Israeli nuclear weapons, and indeed doing nothing to coerce Israel into getting round to a settlement when it's busting all the UN resolutions. Why not do something more compelling to bring about a settlement in the Middle East?
Okay, thank you. Question at the back. Lady in the middle, then I'm going to go to you. Here, you first, and exactly, and then pass the microphone there. Yes, thank you.
I'm Teresa from Phoenix TV Hong Kong, and I'd like to ask, how would you respectively propose to strengthen the relationship with China in the future, if you were going to, and how would you balance the relationship with China and US? Thank you.
And please, question here.
Nazanin Ansari, Kayhan, London. One of the challenges facing Britain in the next few years will be Iran, and the monopolization of the Iranian politics and economy by the Islamic Revolutionary Guards Corps. Today, a group of Italians and Iranians resident in Italy were arrested for smuggling arms via Italy to Iran. What measures do you think Britain can take as not to allow Britain to become a base of operations for IRGC front companies and agents? Thank you.
We could probably take Iran in a bigger dimension as well, but you have a very specific question there. Now, we've got quite a few items, and I do want to make sure, because at least I had 3 comments come in here, specifically on the issue of the relationship between DFID and the FCO. And how do we balance, and this is a classic question which I'm sure you get all the time, but the push for preventative actions, R2P, avoiding fragile states, are we striking the right sort of balance organizationally, financially, in the kind of relationship that exists between the FCO and the Department for International Development? How might things be done differently, perhaps by others? Foreign Secretary, how do you see this particular challenge yourself? If we could touch on those issues, and again, I've kept a list of that set of questions. We're already at 2:42. I know you have an interview you have to do after this. So it's up to you if you want to eat into that a little bit. So let me start in reverse order, exactly. Ed.
Charles Grant's question, I mean, I think it's a huge dilemma, and I think we need to do an awful lot more thinking on it. I think, first of all, we've got to be leader. Britain's got to make sure that in how it behaves and how it works, particularly with our closest allies, we are upholding those principles. And there are some well-known examples. I may have a debate with the Foreign Secretary on this, but where I don't believe we have been as good as we should have been. So I think leadership by example is really important. And I think whether it's in trade relations, with the EU relations, I think we have some sticks to use, and some, not necessarily sticks, that's the wrong idea, but we've got ways to persuade and to try to get people to move. And I think that, despite your slightly pessimistic presentation, there are some signs in China, for example, where they are beginning to move. And it's maybe a lot more slowly than a Liberal Democrat would want, but nevertheless, we have to give credit where there are those changes. On Israel, I mean, I have to say I do agree with you. I think the current Israeli government is breaking international law and losing a lot of support. And I speak as someone who believes Liberal Democrats are friends of Israel. When we criticise Israel, because we want to be candid friends to it, because we think actually some of the policies it's pursuing are very much against Israel's long-term interests. I mean, it seems to me some of their policies seem to be almost wanting to have permanent struggle with its neighbours, and that really can't be sustainable. I think it really has to give an awful lot more to the peace process. And I met some members of the Knesset a few months back, and they were blaming Palestinians for the deadlock in the peace process, and couldn't give a really convincing reason why that was. I mean, I have to say, the reverse seems to be the case, particularly what we've seen on Gaza, particularly settlements and so on. Now, I was talking to American diplomats, and I was saying, how's Senator Mitchell getting along? And they said, well, remember in Northern Ireland, he was supposed to be a failure for 700 days. On 701, he was a success. And so they were suggesting patience, and they were suggesting that it may not be all as bleak as it looks. But I mean, it does look certainly bleak at the moment, and we just have to hope the great man can do some fantastic things. I'm probably going to leave some of those to others. So.
Yeah, thank you very much on those. William, turn to you, pick up a couple of these.
Yeah, well, very quickly then, on a vast range of all very important subjects. I think on the Charles Grant question, this is really what I was talking about earlier when I was saying that some of the emerging powers in the world have a narrower definition of national interest and their responsibilities in world affairs. It doesn't include encouraging democratic values in other nations. There is no immediate solution to this. I think it guides us in the direction in the future of knowing that we have to be an inspiring example of our own values ourselves. You know, it will, if it is true that in the middle of this century, by the middle of this century, the whole European economy will only be 10% of the world economy, or something like that, well then Europe imposing sanctions on somebody in 2050 is not going to be a very frightening policy. And so we are going to have to make sure that we are the great example of how political freedom, economic liberalism, open trade can work to the rest of the world.
So less by active promotion and more by example, because you come up with the phrase...
I'm not saying we shouldn't actively promote it, but our ability to in any way, to go any way towards imposing our values on other people will be diminished over time, the way the world economy is going. And that means we must always look to our... Never cease advocating those ideas, but we must look to, in particular, to be great upholders of those values ourselves. That's why the point I was making earlier about the moral authority of the United States is so fundamentally important. The question about Israel, well, I think we're very worried. We are all in favour of a two-state solution in the Middle East, and I think all worried that it will slip away. There is not an infinite time frame for bringing that about, and any British government has to do its utmost to push that along. Problems aren't all on one side, however. And so we will have to do our utmost, but that includes, we can only do that working with all the allies that we have mentioned. In China, I think consistency and clarity are the watchwords of relations with China. So that if we have debates with them about human rights, well, then we always have that debate, but always within the context of a strong economic and political relationship. And I think it is time to try to move on top of the economic dialogue that we have formalized with China, to move to the level of strategic dialogue with China in the future as well. On Iran, well, yes, very good point. There's still some bite in our ability to impose sanctions from Europe and the United States. We haven't reached the middle of the century yet, and we should be doing so on Iran, particularly on the activities of the IRGC and its front companies and associated financial institutions. I hope the sanctions that will be imposed on Iran will include financial sanctions that mirror those of the United States on Iran, because they, I think, have had some bite attached to them. FCO and DFID, well, the Conservative government is very much committed to the Department for International Development as a separate department. That is well established, and indeed to meeting the 0.7% target of GNP devoted to development. I see that almost as a separate question from the finances and position of the Foreign Office. I do think that whatever the level of funding of the Foreign Office, it shouldn't be decided on the basis of how the exchange rate goes up and down. Yeah, and I think that when ministers signed off on that 2 years ago with quite catastrophic results, they were asleep at the wheel when the exchange rate was about to fall off a cliff. And the British Foreign Office has had some very serious difficulties as a result. That can't be the right way to fund the foreign. I can't find any other major nation in the world that funds its Foreign Office on the basis of where its exchange rate stands that particular day.
And so you've got that hidden. Let me ask you, there was a very specific question about ESDP versus Franco UK relations?
Oh, sorry, yes, I'm
That
trying to
specific
fit.
one.
Yes, my concern on that is that we should always think of capabilities rather than structures. You know, the really important thing is to enhance European capabilities in the defence and military field. And our concern has always been about excessive duplication between EU structures and NATO structures. But partly our attitude will depend on how things work. You know, I've just been advocating that we should be muscular about having an EU force in Bosnia. We shouldn't be withdrawing that when there is uncertainty there. And so we do have to show capability if we are going to justify structures. I think it's that way around.
David, well, look, a bunch of questions, and I might throw one extra one in the end. One extra coming from Uruguay.
I think William needs to talk to his defence spokesman, because his defence spokesman sees European security and defence cooperation as a threat to NATO, contrary to every other government in Europe, contrary to the United States as well, and perhaps contrary to what Williams just said, because it's absolutely evident that the future of European defence has got to be as a partnership with NATO, and this old-fashioned view that somehow European cooperation on defence is a threat to NATO is frankly a throwback to the 80s and to the 90s, and I really think that the Tories need to get themselves clear on this, because they are outside the American mainstream, never mind the European mainstream on that. Let me just pick up three of the points which I've got time for. The mechanistic view of quote-unquote democracy promotion has undermined the importance of a really strong values-based approach to people expressing their freedom, not just through free media, but also through the ballot box. It's also the case that the suggestion of a single destination for all political systems in the way they organize their politics, the so-called end of history thesis, it's also been a torpedo aimed at the sort of careful engagement that I think is going to be the essence of the kind of relations that Charles wants to see, not just between countries, but between peoples within countries as well. And I think it's very, very important that reformers around the world who are standing up for values that we share don't feel that they're on their own. One of the most moving moments for me as Foreign Secretary was when the monks in Rangoon marched past the British embassy and clapped. And that is a remarkable, they weren't only applauding the government, they were applauding the people of this country who they saw as standing up for the sort of values that they would like to express. And it's sometimes difficult, because the last thing the Green movement in Iran wants is us to say, well, that we want them to be the government of Iran. That is it's not our job to choose the government of Iran, but it is our job to say that people in Iran who are trying to assert their own constitutional human rights and democratic rights should have the support of decent people everywhere. And I think it's very, very important that we don't lose that. Secondly, I think, sir, if you read the Israeli press, I'm not sure you'd describe the British position as having no pressure on Israel. That's certainly not the way it's seen there. I believe that Israel, if anything, has the greatest amount to fear from lawlessness in the Middle East rather than lawfulness. And I think it's very, very important that a democratic country like Israel upholds the highest standards, both in respect of international law and in respect of its own commitments at home. I think that I talk actually about a 23-state solution in the Middle East, because I think it's very, very hard to see a future for the Palestinians unless you see it in the wider context of 21 other Arab states and Israel living as part of a 23-state region. I think that the dangers are very, very stark at the moment, because the promise that's been made not just by Palestinian leaders but by Western leaders for a long time to the Palestinian people, which is that the democratic negotiated road will deliver them a state, is under severe threat. And that is a very, very dangerous thing, not just for the countries of the region, but more widely. And I think that no one should be in any doubt, whether in Israel or anywhere else, about the importance that is attached to that. For a President of the United States to say it is in the national interest of his country to achieve a Palestinian state that can live alongside Israel is a very, very singular commitment. And it's one that needs to be followed through with patience, but also with a sense of urgency and passion. And I know from my conversations with George Mitchell, but also with the Secretary, that that is felt. Look, just on FCO relations with other departments, but I think this is an interesting and important point. One of the things that we discussed 3 years ago inside the Foreign Office was the mission of the Foreign Office. And the first objective we set ourselves was to lead the British diplomatic mission from all departments around the world. Because it's true that many departments now have representatives in other countries, not just in the Home Office in respect of crime, or DFID or the MOD, but also environment and others. And I think that that is a very, very signal statement that the Foreign Office should lead the British effort in countries around the world. It's also, though, important that we look at where cooperation is at its greatest. And I think that if you go to Afghanistan, which is the hardest case, but if you go to the civilian military mission in Helmand province, one of the most dangerous places in the world, but also one of the most highly aided places in the world, you see a degree of integration of Foreign Office and development effort that is absolutely remarkable. What is even more remarkable is that a civilian is leading the mission, which has a very large number of MOD personnel working for it as well. And it is a degree of integration that gives a lie to the organograms that you read about in Whitehall. Because actually on the ground, if you're Governor Mangal of Helmand province, you see a British mission which is actually leading some other internationals as well. You don't see bits of DFID or bits of the Foreign Office or bits of the MOD or even bits of other departments. You actually see an integrated British presence. And it seems to me that we have to make sure that that is what we hold on to as the future of British foreign policy.
Thank you very much for those points. We could go on, and I think the question about whether you could have a strategic relationship with China is one that perhaps we weren't able to give as much justice to, but we have gone over time. I want to thank, first of all the members who've come today for taking the time to join this meeting. I want to thank all of those outside the hall who sent in questions, some of which we got to, some of which we didn't. You'll be kind to know, or pleased to know, a lot of people in here didn't get their questions answered either. But we had questions in from Uruguay about South America, which we never got to, about the Navy, the Royal Navy from California, and about also from Australia, about Europe. I'd also like to thank our three speakers, because they really have taken the time out from what we all know is a very busy period in the year, to share their thoughts, to share their ideas, to be non-partisan where they were non-partisan. I think it's quite remarkable the amount of congruity there is in views, except for that one particular issue which we will keep discussing about Europe. But thank you very much for taking the time. If you could please stay in the room, the rest of you, so I could please get three speakers out, because I have an interview with very little time left to do.